I'm good. If you guys are
All
all
right.
good.
Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm June Miller Richards, and I am with Entity Academy. I work on school outreach and mentors, and I'm really happy to be here today for the next installment of our ongoing Entity and Woz U Fireside Chats. I have the great pleasure today to introduce our wonderful moderator, Stephanie Stanton, a good friend of mine. Stephanie, who is a national TV news correspondent and career business journalist. Stephanie's worked for such outlets as NBC News, Fox 11 LA, CNBC, Bloomberg, and more. She's also, which makes her even more relevant to us, the creator and founder of CareerChick.com, a website that encourages young women to pursue their passions to land their dream job. I'm, again, really pleased to be here. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us. And now, take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, June. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this fireside chat. So excited to be here today, along with our special guest. She is Kristin Kostka. She's an award-winning computational epidemiologist and the current director of the Odyssey Center. And her topic today is a very timely one, changing the world through open data science. Kristin, thank you so much for being with us. I'm particularly excited about this because I had a chance to pre-screen Kristin. We had a great conversation, and I am just so impressed by her, and I hope that you all will be as well. So Kristin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Before we talk about your current position, I know it's your incoming position, which you can explain, and the Odyssey Center, I'd like to have you talk about your background. Give us your educational background and what led you to this point.
Absolutely. So am I still sharing my screen? I'm not sure if I am. I was trying to see you guys because I can't see you when I have that up.
You're not sure.
I am really excited to tell you because I come from kind of a very diverse background. I went to school for exercise science in my undergrad, and I went to Elon University. I did that about 10 years ago, and then I moved into the space of epidemiology and public health, and I became fascinated with this idea of collecting data, understanding patients, and I've gone on a pretty circuitous journey from working in clinical trials to working at Medicare to working at Deloitte Consulting, building their real world evidence practice, to my last job, which I'm leaving this week, is IQVIA, where I'm a data aggregator. But really circuitously, I ended up on this Odyssey, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. And it's really this commitment to open innovation and open science. And that's my passion as an epidemiologist. How do I improve and help people? And of course, as we know now with COVID, it's really important that we come together and share our science and impact the greater good. So my background might sound really kind of a mix. I'm a pretengineer. That's my favorite word to describe my tech skills. I am a recovering SaaS user. So I wasn't always the most technical, but now I am a lot more technical. And I want to orient you too to some of the phrases I use, just so as we get into the dialogue, if you hear this, you're like, oh, okay, here's what she means. So I'm just going to go through quickly this term, this moniker you see right above my head, OHDSI. What the heck is that? So I'm going to pull up and walk you through just a little bit about this community. So this is an initiative that's way bigger than me as a human, and it's really exciting. So Odyssey is an acronym for the Observational Health, Data Sciences, and Informatics community. So people say it's like an Odyssey, like, the story about how Homer went out and he went around a lot. It was a long journey. Well, real world data is kind of similar to that. For those of you who munge it, I'm sure you know. And this community's mission is to improve health by empowering a community to collaboratively generate the evidence to promote better health decisions and ultimately better care. We really want to change and make it possible to look across all of the data we see to help patients. And it's got a website you guys can go to. But just tactically, like, what is it? It's a global community of more than almost 4,000 people, representing about 300 different types of institutions. There's 2.7 billion patient records that have been standardized into this model. And that's about, with uniqueness, about 10% of the world's population uses this analytics model, which is really cool. And we can talk about the science and how we generate these really, really large understandings of different types of disease. But what's really fascinating is I joined this community about 6 years ago. I just showed up at a meeting and I just kept showing up and they kept giving me a space at the table, and they're really, really open. And we're going to talk about that more. But the number of dots on this plot changes pretty much every time I look at it. We get more that pop up. And there's more and more people who are coming together, and there's lots of initiatives that are funding this, both in the US. The federal government has many initiatives going around this. There's one from the NIH and one from the FDA. In Europe, there's a lot of funding too. And the same thing with Asia. So it's really, really cool to be part of this like global group of people who are a bunch of health data nerds. And they come from different skill sets. So what I want you guys to kind of feel is that I may be an epidemiologist by training, but I'm only a tiny slice of this pie. We have folks from a mix of academia and government, from health systems, from technology companies, from pharmaceutical companies, from large payer organizations, and even patient advocacy groups. And our disciplines are very, very different. Some people are computer scientists. Some people are more methodologists. They're epidemiologists like me. Some people are clinicians. And it's really that diverse team that brings some of the best science that we have. So I just want you guys to have that context as we talk, because I think it's really important, you know, I'm one of this tiny slice, but you might be a different slice. And so I want you to think about that. And the last thing would be, it's growing over time. It's like a hockey stick. When I joined 5 years ago or 6 years ago, it was a little bit less penetrated of having sites that understood what we were doing. And now I haven't even updated this because we were too busy with COVID, but the hockey stick just keeps going up and up. So it's my long-winded hello. Welcome to my vernacular. Hope we're gonna have fun. I know, Stephanie, you and I had fun chatting, but hopefully as we go through these terms, we'll start to stick a little bit.
Yeah. And Kristin, you know, you got me thinking when you were going over all that with COVID. I mean, this sounds like the perfect storm for someone like you with a background in epidemiology, right? I mean, isn't this, you know, the mother lode, like
Absolutely.
studying it, researching it?
It felt like everything I had done in my life had been up to this point where we were like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I mean, a pandemic is terrible, but as an epidemiologist, like you only ever hear about it. It's like,
Right?
you don't know you're going to live through one. And I think I'm on the other side of the curve where I'm so exhausted. I have like, you know, adrenaline pumping through my veins again. But a year ago, well, a little more than a year ago, about 14 months ago, we started to say, what can we do? We have all these people that have all this information. And we actually had like a digital hackathon. So we got onto an MS Teams environment. We started to break out by groups, like who can do this type of like standardization. So we were like, how do you find COVID codes if they don't exist? Can I build definitions for people to use? What can I do to create questions? You know, what kind of resources are we using? We built a lot of models in the beginning that were like, how do I predict who's going to be more severe? Because, you know, we had a lot of rationing of what could we do with the limited amount of things we had. And that was a global issue. But we were fighting something we didn't know what it looked like. We didn't know if we were doing a good job of differentiating. Of course, on the other side of it now, we have so much information. We're still, you know, up to our ears in, I think there's like a joke that there's now more COVID papers than COVID patients, but I don't know if that's actually true. But it was a perfect storm. We already had a data network. We had done some work in hypertension and in cardiovascular disease and kind of tested the pipes. And then infectious disease kind of put it all like to the test. We were suddenly working around the clock. I mean, I sat on conference calls every day for about 4 months until we decided Sundays are a good day to take it off. Like we should really like hang out with our families once a week. But there was some great evidence to be generated. And then when the NIH dispersed funding, all of a sudden we had people who could say, hey, here's some code we already wrote. You can take advantage of it. It's been really, really cool. And I can send you guys different links, but tons of work getting reused across like the EMA, basically the FDA of Europe. They're using this to look at blood clots because we just saw this in the news, right? Spoiler alert, it's worse for you to take oral contraceptives than to get the J&J vaccine. So I'm going to be your public service announcement. Get vaccinated. That's what we really need in the data now. Selfishly, I want to see that data. But yeah, it's been so fun and really rewarding to know that we could do this as a community.
That's awesome. And again, it sounds so exciting, especially for someone with your background. So take us through, we want to talk about some of the different types of settings, obviously, that you've worked in. There's clinical trials, Medicare, big tech, consulting, different things that you can work with, or different opportunities for folks who want to sort of pursue a career in your field. So let's simplify it a little bit, break it down for us, and then we can get into, as you guys all know, I don't probably have a technical background as much as many of you. So if I'm too basic or I'm too top line, you want to go deeper, throw it in the chat, interrupt me, because I want to make sure that everyone gets as much as they want, as deep as they want, with Kristin. So let's break down, first of all, let's start with the basics, and then we can kind of take a deeper dive.
Absolutely. So if you're like, wow, this is cool, how do I get started? Well, you're already in the right place by starting to think about getting technical skills. Regrettably, our whole world involves technology, whether you identify as a technologist or not, right? Actually, one of my favorite just gaffes in COVID is that the spreadsheet issue they had in the UK, where they were tracking COVID cases in Excel. And as some of you may know, Excel actually has boundaries on how many rows and columns that can exist. And they actually underreported the number of cases simply because they ran out of lines in the technology. So it's a terrible joke, but it really tells you we have to think bigger than some of our traditional things that we start getting trained on. And so I think if you come from different backgrounds, where you can contribute your skills, communities like this have a couple of needs. We have a real need for translators, people who know how to read something technical and then kind of bring the insight of how does that apply to me as a stakeholder that I am. It's a huge piece of what I do. Sometimes you need people who are really deep in the method. So if you really like model development and you're more of a machine learning person, there's totally a place for you where you can kind of contribute and say, I want to tackle this one narrow question, and I want to kind of contribute and build the technical, package basically that goes with it to test and train it. Totally a spot for you. And then I think the computer science part that's kind of interesting is a lot of us don't know how to program efficiently. I'll just admit it. I was not an object-oriented programmer. That is not something I started with, and many of us aren't. And so getting to go through curriculums like this and learning and seeing and getting the opportunity to do pair programming or looking at other people's code libraries can really help you see oh, that's how we do this. I'm running a package right now for a colleague, and he only ever works on kind of smaller data. He's like, why is it taking so long? Your results haven't been generated. I gave it to you yesterday. Well, your joins are kind of inefficient. I think you could do this, but I'm running the code as you gave it to me just to give you back the output you expect. So if you think like that, if you're like, man, I know how to make this better. There's a role for that. That's, the unsung hero, because getting speed to information, time to results is so key. And then the science, there's lots of opportunities as topical things come up. So COVID, I feel these days you can go to a webinar a week about different aspects of, if you want to know the vaccine science, if you want to know how we're measuring adverse events, how are we looking at long COVID? That's a really big thing right now. So there's all sorts of subtopics within the science, and you can pick what you're interested in. And I think for anyone who's interested, just show up. That's the first thing. Show up and be willing to kind of be part of the experience, and don't expect much out of yourself in the process. Just be kind to your ability to learn. Because I think I regularly am reminded, I don't know anything. Even though I know lots of things, I don't know anything when I start a project. And so these types of communities are a great opportunity to be right next to somebody who knows everything about it clinically. And then you can pick up, oh, well, I can help you code that. And so somebody asked a question about MACRA, HEDIS, and new ICD-10 codes. And I get the feeling you're a quality person, or maybe you work in a healthcare organization. What can I ask you a little bit about what you do today, so I can answer with the right context?
Yeah, and Tabitha, Kristin, I can monitor the chat if it's easier for you. But Tabitha, if you can turn your audio on, maybe we can just get a few more of those details. I think it will be easier that way. Where is she? Uh-oh. Is she muted?
And if talking out loud gives you anxiety, you can just type it too. But
I just be curious because
Sorry about that. I had to run and get some water.
There you go. Hi.
Hi. I'm actually a coder. I do coding and billing for
Mm-hmm.
UCLA, advanced radiology coding. And I've always been interested in data science, especially where, as it pertains to, based on what you said with your introduction, I was wondering, how does data science work in like MACRA and HEDIS, and also changing and creating new ICD-10 coding?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I've done some HEDIS projects. I've done chart chasing to find the record that matches what we capture. So for those of you who don't know, HEDIS, it's a quality system that's basically how organizations get paid for the care they deliver. And you get HEDIS scores. And then it's basically a way that we monitor quality across. So sometimes you'll be driving on well, maybe not the highway, but I've been driving around Boston before and I've seen signs that say, we are a so many star hospital. And like these types of systems are what inform how people get those ratings. So the type of work that I do is entirely dependent on having good coders like yourself and other folks to do routine collection of electronic health data, whether it's in an electronic like health system, or it's like hospital charge data, administrative claims. We very much sit in what I call like the secondary use of data world. And there's a huge community of data scientists who never, I don't get to touch the patient. I see a de-identified data set. And so accurate coding is huge because we're trying to figure out kind of what happened to this person in routine care. So that's a huge input. And the new ICD-10 codes, what's kind of interesting, COVID's a really great example. So there's like a period of time when you run a study and you're like, oh, well, long COVID didn't exist, and even in probably, I'd say as we got into the second or third wave, so that would be like the middle to the end of last year, there wasn't an ICD code for it, but there started to be clinical attributes. And then the people who issue ICD-10, they kind of came to a consensus on what that clinical code would be. They issued it. But we kind of see the before and after world where we can compare and say, well, here's things that kind of look like that, but don't have that attribute coded in the data. And then we have kind of the gold standard, which is it actually existed and I can validate. So the coding systems that we have in our source data, which would be ICDs, if you guys work in like drug data, it'd be things like your NDC, RX norm, you hear things like MEDBRA, MESH. I can tell you a whole alphabet soup if you want, but we rely on ontologies or ways that people organize this information as kind of like the bedrock of how we think about bringing together and building interoperable like study designs. So there's a whole like piece to our world that's about working with communities that issue these kind of coding systems, understanding their update frequency, understanding how we can learn from them, how can they be bi-directional. I don't know if you guys work in measurement data at all, but Loink is a really great example. They're out of Regan Street Institute in Indianapolis. Loink has been around for like 70 years now at this point, which you're like, how is that possible? Like electronic health records haven't been around that long, but they've been standardizing labs even when it was on paper. And they're a group that people engage to understand and build ways to code this information. So that's a huge piece of our data sciences. How do you find and create like a feature? How do I know that thing exists or doesn't? So those kinds of things really inform it because there are ways to organize that information.
That's cool. We have another question from Ramona. Do you often work with individual data? She says, I would imagine you would be working most often with large blocks of data.
Yeah. So I go between different levels of our data model in our open science approach. It's a person-centric model. So at the very bottom, there are person IDs and people are linked by how they exist as a person. And we actually have data quality rules that say, to be a person in this data set, you have to have a birth date. You have to have at least one type of clinical encounter, like very simple things, but you'd be surprised how many people don't have birth dates in some of the data sets we use. And very tough to assess certain things if you don't know how old somebody is, and then if you don't know their gender or, so I work a lot in data quality, capturing individual variations in how information is captured. And then I roll up to the cohort. So your cohort is a group of people who share some type of attribute. It could be a diagnosis. It could be even a physical location. could be lots of stuff. And our cohorts end up being kind of how we describe and share information. And what's really cool about our network is we publish these cohort definitions, and because we're all using a similar kind of information model, I can send a definition to my colleagues in the UK. I can send one to my colleagues in Asia, and we're all using similar like interoperable terms and defining it in a consistent way. And then when we write papers, we can say, well, I was able to observe this not just in my database, but in a database, you know, in another part of the US, or a database in Europe or Asia or South America. And so the large blocks of data kind of are like the aggregate that we get to. So we never move data out of a site in most cases. There's a couple of programs that have what we call data use agreements, and they're allowed to. Most of it stays behind the firewall. We don't want to deal with patient privacy issues. And of course, your favorite, like insert your favorite acronym there, like GDPR, you'll hear. There's a lot of concern about protecting privacy. And so our model purposely doesn't want to do that. And we want to figure out sharing results with each other that are comparable and use similar scientific principles.
It sounds really, from a layman's perspective, what I'm hearing you say is it sounds like maybe even in recent years that your field has gotten more streamlined. I feel like maybe, and maybe I'm wrong, but like back in the day, it was like UCLA or, you know, USC or whomever, you know, Johns Hopkins was working on this and these guys were working on that. And am I wrong in saying that now it seems like you guys are able to share information better? And as a result of that, has that advanced medicine, you know, beyond anyone's wildest expectations?
Yeah, I think there's the old paradigm, which is like, I just need to do this in the data I have access to. But a lot of people are asking the question, can I reproduce that same clinical finding in, you know, maybe the same exact type of population in a different state, or, you know, maybe an adjacent population in a different country? So we have worked a lot to build methods, which is a totally active area of experimentation, but creating benchmarks for how do I assess the quality of a real world data set? Like, all data is inherently biased. And as an epidemiologist, I could go into a rabbit hole on what is bias, but I'll save you from the epi rant. But like, the idea that we should be able to reproduce a finding seems really simple. Like, if I look at hypertension patients, shouldn't I be able to describe them in Massachusetts or California or in Texas or in Florida? And the problem is that sometimes these single center like research papers you're used to seeing, they don't even think about that. They don't know how their method would work in a different center. So yeah, we've been very lucky to come together as a community and start to generate kind of ways to interrogate your data. So I'm sure a lot of you spend a lot of time munging and cleaning data, and it feels endless, and it is endless. You'll always be cleaning your data. But we actually have like data quality frameworks that we send across different sites. And before we get into anything too crunchy, we just start to share that. And we start with, do we all speak and use the same type of information? If not, do we know why we vary? Some things are very explainable. It's like, oh yeah, that source system doesn't code at that level of detail. Some things are less explainable. We don't know why a whole subset of people don't show up in your data. I was on a call yesterday where someone said they were looking at transplant patients, and they said all transplant patients must be on this drug regimen. It's very common. It's how they don't, reject their transplant. And we couldn't find it in the data. We only found like 60% coverage of these drugs. And we're like, I don't know why that happens, but we can work with the sites. Well, it turns out these people that they made all these assumptions about, that database didn't uphold it. So their basic, like how they started the question was wrong. So it's learning how to be kind of, cyclical in how you think about it. Like, can I control this? Yes or no? It's a tree. You go one way or the other. If I can't, what do I do to expose that and let other people know I had this limitation? And I'm sure when you guys get into your model development, you'll see that a lot, right? What was the assumption this was built on?
That's so cool. Thank you. I want to talk about Ryan's question in the chat. I think it bears worth mentioning. Ryan asked if you personally ever gather your data, also asked if you have a book you can recommend. You do have a textbook that you helped write.
That's correct.
One of many impressive accomplishments here. Tell us about this.
So this book, it's kind of funny. We as a community in this Odyssey collaborative, we have a lot of people that just came together and were like, this is great. But we had a lot of like a priori or like ghost knowledge is the term somebody called it, where it's all in our heads. So we actually did an effort 2 years ago to write it down and create. So we have a book that's published, but it's actually a living textbook on GitHub. And so we use Markdown to generate it. And I'm in charge of updating it every so often. We have different chapters that kind of talk through our evolution of how we built this framework. And so you asked, like, do I ever personally gather my own data? Not usually. Years ago, I used to do clinical trials and I was involved with case report forms, and that was a big part of my life. For secondary use of data, I'm mostly setting up agreements with people who have already have a system in place. So maybe they have an electronic health record, they've de-identified a subset of patients, and I can do some research with them. Although it's funny because the other week I was listening to my mom tell me something that happened to her after she got her Moderna vaccine. I was like, Mom, we need to report this case study to a registry so somebody knows that this data point exists. So that was the only time recently I've captured my own data. And if you're curious, if you're having funny immune responses after you get your vaccine, find somewhere to report it. We need you to tell us what's happening to you because sometimes we don't see it in your like your regular clinical interaction. So that's me.
Interesting that you know, because sometimes, you know, we'll do things in life, or like one of us will have a reaction and we just don't bother to report it because we think like, oh, it's not going to matter. I'm just one person. But you're saying like that one person, your own mom, like that matters.
Yep, you matter. So we don't see you as an individual in the data. Like I don't see Kristen, I don't see Stephanie, I don't see Maria. But when I build cohorts, I might look for people with attributes like me. And so where to report it is a good question. It kind of depends on what it is. So like, let's say you get a vaccine, and like, especially the COVID vaccines, but it could be, you know, there's a whole bunch of other things. You get tetanus, you get HPV. I would say if you have something happen, like, don't be afraid to call your doctor and tell them, hey, I had this, just so you know. They have a way to report it. Like the CDC has all sorts of systems for surveillance. So does the FDA. And oftentimes they start with your doctor's office to see, did the patient, and so they don't really want, I did, LOL. Yeah, me too. I have this problem. Sometimes my mom actually said to me, my doctor doesn't do anything. He didn't do it. And I was like, all right, Mom, we'll work on this. But the thing that's really tricky is patient reported data is considered its own bucket of data that has to go through different types of data quality. And so some people like to, like hold it in a different area because they're like, well, a clinician didn't do it. What if you're a clinician and diagnosing yourself? Like, give me a break. You went to medical school. You know what you're talking about. But I think the reason they do stuff like that is they think someone's going to adjudicate or like add some level of rigor to what you're reporting. But I'm sure our colleague with the coding, I'm sure you can tell me, you know, way more than some of those clinicians coding some of those encounters. So it's kind of a funny system. To be able to create signal, you have to know how to enter it in and get it somewhere that someone looks at it. So I don't say we have a silver bullet. I think the US is actually a little bit behind on this. Other countries have better public health surveillance systems that it's just part of the record. So I think we can definitely compare and contrast. Like no one has the perfect response to how we track and like trace our people, how we do it in a way that makes people feel comfortable. Like you can get into the weird big brother stuff. I'm not touching that, but you know, we ultimately want to find ways to make sure we do see it. So if you and 3 other people, suddenly you might be a big enough cell size, I could use that in an analysis.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so Suzanne was asking, how about people who don't have a declared general practitioner or general physician, GP?
Yeah, insurance is funny like that. It like really biases how we interact with our healthcare system. And in the US in particular, I feel like I'm routinely explaining to my colleagues outside the US, like, oh, I know that this is going to be captured this way because we reimburse in this manner, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. And it is. You know, if you're in a system of care where like you don't have someone who's like assigned to you, theoretically you should still have like I have a my chart that I interact with I don't have a declared GP either. I just have like a team of people who are like I call. But I mean, in that case, I can look it up. But the CDC sometimes gives you those little sheets and you don't even read them, but like there's a link on there. Do we do a good job with the health science communication? No, we're terrible at it. I'll just be honest. But we have 16 levels of risk that you have to self-identify. So the system needs a little help. And if you have ideas, innovation is a huge piece of where we could benefit.
Let's talk about the career path of data science. Obviously, we have a lot of people here who may be exploring that career path. Is there anything that you want to tell them in terms of a background, navigating that path? Yes, you definitely need this. Here's how to do it. Give us a step-by-step.
Don't get married to the technology. So like if your whole world of how you approach data science is like, I love insert whatever your favorite tech is, right? Like I love R or I love Python. I think you have to be, if you're going down this journey, you have to be willing to embrace like our tech changes it feels like with the weather, but it's every few years, something new comes out that's trying to replace the other thing. So having an appetite and like kind of just a bit of forgiveness to yourself to allow yourself to keep learning the new thing. It's hard. I don't love it either, but there's definitely some opportunity there where some of the newer stuff we have is actually great, right? Your code will run faster or it just does something different. I think data science has this like mystique that you need to be credentialed in a very specific way, or I need to have a PhD, or I need to have, whatever. I think the best learning I've ever had, so I have a master's degree. I didn't say it earlier, but I'm actually going back to school and getting a part-time DPhil this fall. We'll come back to that. I just felt like I needed to do it part-time, like, because why not? Who doesn't just like, decide they're going to get a PhD? But don't feel like that's the only way to get training. So experiential learning is the best I've found in data science, which is to say, if you can get access to different types of projects that stretch you, so starting with cleaning the data to then analyzing it and understanding what kind of questions. I think knowing the right questions to ask your data is a huge piece of data science. I see lots of people generate things and we're like, what's the so what? Like, what are you doing with it? And the answer is, I don't know, like it was cool. Like that's a okay place to start. But like if you really want to be in the field, you want to find a niche where you're like passionate about something and you understand it's like how it impacts, the real world, because doing things just for the sake of doing it, eventually it kind of dries up. So I think that's a big thing for me. I found different places. Like I haven't always done COVID. I did a lot of chronic disease before. I'll change my mind in a few months when I'm over COVID. So you don't have to necessarily stay in a box. You just have to think about how your skills translate.
Kristin, this is kind of a personal question. All of us in life, we choose a field that we're passionate about. We choose a field because we feel like we want to make a difference. Can you give us a personal example? I mean, you've done so many fabulous things, but is there a personal example where you can say, I worked on this clinical trial and as a result, this happened. And then we have a new drug that hit the market. Like, is there a tangible example, or I'm sure you have more than one that you can give us? Because like you said, sometimes we just do stuff and we're just researching, or we're going down a path. And then we're like, is this even making a difference? Or do you have any real world examples?
Yeah. So I have a couple, but I have one. So sometimes you start doing something and you're not sure what value it has to you. And this is how this kind of started. So I used to work in an interventional cardiology lab. Interventional cardiology is basically like you hear about getting balloons or getting stents. That's interventional cardiology. And I remember working on it because my family has a like a genetic trait that we pass down, and I have a twin sister, so I have a real counterfactual. And I was always interested in like understanding, well, how can twins, identical twins, one express something, one not express something? So I ended up in cardiology because it was cool. But what was really fascinating was I worked on a drug that I now see the commercials for. And at the time, I did not appreciate it. I was like, it was just molecule, like you don't know the name of the drug until it's not even called a drug until it's technically approved. It's an experimental agent. So now I watch commercials for very popular interventional cardiology drugs. And I'm like, oh, I remember reading angiograms in the dark. Angiograms are how your blood flows in your heart. It's imaging data. And I remember thinking, this is like, my eyes are going to fall out of my head. What's the point of this? But then I got kind of through the science, and it takes many, many years to get a drug approved. So it's slow. But interestingly enough, that experience kind of like came like full circle this year, because we're doing what we call coagulopathy or blood clot studies. And suddenly I was like, oh, I totally know why blood clots are so important. Like I remember watching these stents and learning how people's hearts, by the way, if you want to go into a fun rabbit hole, if you're a real like data nerd, read about how the heart revascularizes. It's really cool. Your heart can actually build new vasculature when you get a blockage. So sidebar, very interesting. And it's like, just something to look at. But I mean, I never thought that knowing how to read an angiogram would be valuable to doing COVID research or understanding, what blood clots are or aren't a big deal for certain populations. So not only do I see my science in like ads, but I also get to understand and then contextualize to people. Don't worry, I know the benchmark on that. And maybe you guys will have something where you like learn a skill for your, something for a project. You're like, I never thought this would be useful. Like HEDIS measures, you might learn it and think, it's just something to get my job done. But you might be involved with like the NCQA has all these cool projects on how to make HEDIS measures more contemporary, like digitization of HEDIS, so people aren't doing paper-based reporting. So there's a lot of things that you're like, oh, now that I understand what this thing is, I know how to help improve that technology. And that's really important.
That's so cool. And you just described one of my favorite books, The Alchemist, right?
There you go. Yeah.
So that's so cool. I love that. Thank you for sharing. We have a couple people in the chat talking about, Letty said autoimmune diseases would be so interesting. And then also clinician to researcher gaps in lens angles is a huge issue in healthcare research. So maybe kind of touch on those topics.
Yeah, I could try to find. So I just published a paper on COVID and autoimmune conditions, just characterizing like just basically what do we see in people who have prevalent autoimmune conditions. Because there was a lot of hypothesis that like, are they going to do worse because they might be worse? So I spent a lot of time looking at, I'll just go into a very deep niche, look at a population, look at them in a certain period of time. So autoimmune, I think what's interesting is it's a big bucket, right? I don't know if whoever put it in the chat, if you have a condition you're thinking of, but it's everything from things like, could be even immune compromised state, like how that is or isn't related to a biological mechanism. It could be, things like psoriasis, and it could be, plaque psoriasis is really, and lupus is another. So autoimmune means different things to different people. And what I found in my research is that you definitely end up where we all think we're talking about the same thing. It turns out that bucket has so much nuance in it. And so if you're passionate about like autoimmune, you could go a couple of ways. You could just look at, big like trends in the data. You could work in patient advocacy and talk about how do we get better quality information reported. We were just talking about that earlier. There's a lot of quality initiatives on how to help people, because some of these people are really engaging in care and we're not doing a very good job of diagnosing them in the beginning. And there's some trial and error, right? Sometimes we don't actually know why someone's immune system is acting a certain way. Like Hashimoto's is a great example of like usually a trial and error. People find it because they know their parents or their siblings have it. And this might just be like Chinese to you, and that's completely fine. But it's, if you pick an area that you think relates to your life, often that research feels more passionate, like to your identity, because and you understand the patients who benefit from it. And I see some questions about like, that clinician researcher, in traditional, like the traditional paradigm, I guess, there's a lot of mystique around get the MD, and MDs are the only people who can say certain things. And no offense to MDs on the line, but there are a lot of really, really smart people who didn't go to medical school, who are contributing to our understanding of disease, who are just really good, data scientists. You're really good at writing code, or you're really good at working and translating. And so I think in our healthcare research, what we find is the reason we have these multifaceted teams of like different expertise is because each group brings something different, and we get way better like results when we have a team science is like, I mean, I'm sold. Like I've worked with so many groups now that because I had different perspectives in the huddle, we did so much better than if we had only had one perspective that was guiding everything from the outset. So if you're, feeling like you're trying to bridge the world and translate, there's a spot for you to kind of pull in the right expertise and be willing to facilitate that dialogue. We really need it.
Yeah. And again, I know there's not always one path to do one job, but if you could sort of lay out, because Maria was asking how to get hired in this field, is there, data sciences for dummies? Like, can you give people some easy starting steps?
Absolutely. So we have open source tools, and the reason we're in open source is so that everyone has access to the same toolkit, because it's not fair. Some technology is really expensive. And so if you're interested, I'd say gravitate to the open source communities because they're trying to level the playing field for you and give you the same methods that everyone else is using. Google's done a really good job with this with some of their machine learning libraries. Actually, Facebook open sources their libraries too. I think when you're thinking about how do I get hired, so I've done a lot of hiring in my life, and I think what I look for are people that you've started to dip your toe. So maybe in your spare time, you're doing something like this at the Entity Academy, or maybe you're, working on there's a lot of publicly available data you can play with. I'm sure you guys have seen the Kaggle, like they have tons of dream challenges and, play around and explore with like what you can. No one expects you to be an expert in everything. I think you'll find a couple tiers of tracks. You have the individual contributor, somebody who's just going to kind of be working on project work and kind of generating stuff to go into whatever the end state is. So it's kind of vague, but your individual contributor, you'll kind of be by yourself coding. Maybe you go to team meetings. Then there's kind of like contributing through others and managing data science teams. And it's a slightly different skill set. And you'll see like there's a lot of roles of people to be product owners to a data science team and understand the requirements of how do you facilitate not just building the tech, but prioritizing what's relevant to your end users. And product managers help with that too. And so there's a lot of groups you can get hired from. You have, across the board, companies like IQVIA have all these science roles that you can be both a direct scientist. You could go in the MBA bubble and start to capture data, or there's no MBA bubble now. They're out in the world. Or you could be doing large database studies. You'll see IBM has labs in that space. Google Healthcare has a lot of different projects. So I'd say, look across the board. Don't be afraid to explore things like partnerships. That's a big piece in this community, right? Nobody has the one single data set that's going to answer it. So you'll see things like CVS Health and Aetna came together to create an entity. That's going to be a big piece of these companies going forward. So you might see traditional tech like Amazon. They've had a few like kind of pet projects, but you might be better off just like searching words like health data science and see what comes back in LinkedIn. I am constantly surprised by who's hiring for what. And I think your pitch should be, you've got the skills and you've been working hard. You're here on your nights and weekends and you're putting in the time. That to me is really indicative of success, that you are willing to work on yourself to get to that next stage.
Great advice. Thank you. Tabitha had her hand raised. I don't know if her question was answered, but Tabitha, if you want to jump in, we can get you or we can move on.
Yeah, thanks. I had a question regarding clinical documentation and how it affects data science, because I'm sure there's probably healthcare people here that have encountered doctors that will not use laterality, or they are very wishy-washy because they don't want to commit to a diagnosis. So diagnosis versus diagnosis, stuff like that. How does that affect the aggregate of data that you have to, comb through to come to a decision on something?
Yeah. So the fact that you even know that this nuance exists puts you leap years ahead of a lot of my colleagues who like tell me this data is bad. And you're like, no, it's just nuanced, because exactly how we practice medicine, how we pay for care influences exactly what we see in our data. And so what we do, like from where I sit as an epidemiologist, we kind of just appreciate the data for what it is. So I know that clinicians are biased. I know that I'm biased. I'm going to capture data in a certain way. I'm going to write code to build categories in ways that I see information. So what we do when we do these bigger analysis is we actually talk about what we call our cohort diagnostics. So we actually have statistical methods for looking at the definition of a disease, whether you're using it through diagnosis codes, procedures, maybe it's like a proxy for something. If they get this procedure, they're likely to be, some cohort, or drug exposures. I know you're on this combination of drugs, you're probably receiving care for this disease. So we kind of think about it holistically. And then when we run a study or we run like an analysis, we scrutinize each time. Is it this database appropriate? Knowing the bias that I can see, can I do anything in the math to control for this? And control sounds like I could actually change the world. No, I just like, basically when I'm doing the science, I find a way to adjust for that, okay, so this doesn't get coded at this level of detail. Is that enough? Is that the type of thing I'm looking for? I argue this like all day, every day with my colleagues, because there's this assumption that like data is perfect and it's going to be every time it's going to be able to do everything I want it to do. And then there's like another assumption that if you expose data quality, like, oh, that's bad. Like we can't tell people how broken the system is. There's probably somewhere in the middle, like of, and I think as data scientists, you should think about yourself being empowered to inform where you can qualify something to being appropriate for the question you're asking. We don't always know, like the coder, more than anyone because you see the clinician and you know their behavior. Sometimes I only see like the aggregate of it and I have no idea, but there are breadcrumbs left electronically. We call it digital debris of how the system works. And you'll see a lot of people now talk about how do we share insight across different groups. So that's why this community makes me so excited. I sit with people all the time and I say, okay, in claims data, it looks like this. In electronic health records that use, let's say, Epic or Cerner, or maybe you're using Caboodle Epic versus Clarity Epic, like all these system nuances impact a lot of what we can interpret. And so we shouldn't discredit the system, but we should just know that every system has been designed for some purpose. So I don't know if that helps you, if it makes you feel sad because it means we don't have an answer. We just kind of are working on frameworks. Like it's a whole method of exploration. And I have colleagues that, that's their entire job is to work with networks of people to figure out and then basically say, these are the research questions that are appropriate for this type of information.
No, it totally explains everything. Thank you so much. It explains why Nuance is now upgraded and why Microsoft probably is now teamed with Nuance.
Oh yeah. And I think you should think about like the knowledge engineering. I hear that term a lot, which is really like the bucket of all that a priori like understanding of how we design systems. So whether you're in user experience and user design, whether you're more like on the clinical coding side and you know all about the hierarchies of how we build ontologies, the knowledge engineering is becoming even more important because we're expecting more and more of these systems to talk to each other and to do it right. And what happens if like that didn't go the way it was planned? Like, do I have a way to scrutinize that? So like I'm draining databases left and right. I'm just trusting that what I did is right. But reproducing somebody's findings is kind of retracing my steps and making sure we both can get out of the maze together.
Very cool. Thank you. Ramona talked about, she says she can understand how not having a very deep understanding of a subject can be an asset, as in data scientists, having less in-depth knowledge than an MD helps us to see the forest for the trees, so to speak. But I don't know, when I think of that, I don't think of it as having less knowledge. I think of it as processing knowledge differently, because the MDs are there, they are hands-on. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. It's like you see things differently, and that shared perspective is what gets you to a better quality analysis. And so our clinicians, if anyone in the audience is a clinician, I give you a lot of credit. We put you through a lot. You're on your feet all the time. You're seeing patients. You have like 10 minutes to go, get a whole routine workup. And then we're going to use that data to run an analysis later. Like totally wild. So you see a sliver of the world, and it's a mosaic. And then the data scientist who maybe sits in the data warehouse and gets to see, the compilation of those slivers may have a slightly different view because they're at a different atmosphere. One's, landed the plane, the other one's circling, looking for a runway. And I think the thing to be like that I get excited about is teams that are willing to kind of go between altitudes and work together. I think they get a lot of benefit from people who see trends across, like system implementations have really interesting things that happen. And sometimes your data scientist knows how to deal with that, right? Like, let's say you got a new electronic health record in 2018. What if I want to run an analysis that goes to 2016? What do I do for those 2 years that's on a different source system? Maybe because you've been working in the IT side and you have that perspective. And then the clinician can say, well, nothing changed about the way I interact with the patient. It was just my EHR was a different user interface. So I think there's a role for everyone. The perspectives that you have and you bring are very important. And I think it's easy to like feel like I don't know anything or I know everything. Like it's such a continuum. Most days I know nothing, so I'm okay with that. But I think when you're doing an analysis, the more you can kind of buddy up with people who have one side or the other, way more effective. I've done a lot of tech deployments that didn't have any practical, like didn't have really good user acceptance testing with end users that were actually going to use it. Yeah, not that successful. The system's not in use years later. I wonder why. Like, tech can't be just for the sake of tech, and then research can't be for the sake of research. They kind of have to intermix.
Great. Daisy has a question. She's raising her hand. Daisy, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Kirsten. My name's Daisy. Sorry I was late. But I have since you brought up about system nuances and how a lot of the systems out there, like in regards to electronic medical records, they come in different packages with an a la carte kind of purchase design. So there's a lot of different sections within the electronic medical chart that is from different packages.
Yep.
And some of them, they can be connected with and integrated with each other. And then some, from what I've observed, some really are not able to connect until they actually upgrade it to another version, or if you buy extra package to connect them.
Yep.
So from your experience and what you've been exposed to, especially since we're in data science and we have to look through all the information systems, some of them are structured, and the way that our clinicians and how we use them, they're not structured, and how we prefer not being structured. So that's why data science was needed, and to go into AI, prepare for AI and machine learning. So from what you've been exposed to, are there any platforms or companies that's already made something that's perfect enough to replace all these systems that's already implemented?
No, it's a feedback loop. So I think that's a really, really good point, right? Like in our systems that we use, it's so configuration is such a big thing, and I could go into a whole lecture on that in general. But I think there's a lot of benefits. So some systems are really, really good and kind of designed to capture very structured, coded clinical information. And then you have really good free text, like in a field somewhere, and your physician has written something amazing. And so natural language processing projects, I think, are definitely, there's a lot of technology out there. You have things like, what's the AWS one? They have Comprehend. They have like it's a microservice you can use if you're on an AWS cloud. Comprehend can kind of go through unstructured information and tag it to something more structured. So like if a term is used in a certain way, it knows that clinical insight means something. It can even do things like negation, where it knows it's not that thing, which is kind of neat. So I think the only hazard with natural language processing that I've seen, so I've worked both with Comprehend. I've worked with Informatics is a company I've worked with before. They're very much designed for purpose. So when we pull things out and we ask a system to kind of curate and create a derived insight, we validate it against something. And so sometimes we can't use that same derivation every time we do analysis. We have to run something new. We're working, so the reason I like data standardization, that's like actually what we do a lot of in my Odyssey work, is that we spent a lot of time creating a common analytic model. So the common data model is like has conventions and ways to put that information in the same spot. It uses shared ontologies. And so it doesn't take out all of the guesswork, but it gives some kind of, so let's say you have an Athena Health maternal and child health module, but then you have an Epic installation that's all the general practice. And common data models are kind of nice because they can just they see your source. You build an extract transform load, you can drop it into the common data model, and then it exists as a data mart. And you don't even have to think what's in the data mart, like where did it start, because that's been kind of handled in the munging upfront. And then you're testing that it adhered to convention. So that's where data quality comes back in. But I think knowing what you know, Daisy, like you have an understanding of how we are very much beholden to the way we deploy technology can sometimes impact the amount of information we see in a system. So like I work with lots of health systems who are kind of like, oh my God, we have to figure out going back to our data warehouse and how do we stitch this together and what do I do? And there's entire jobs that, like, if I don't know if you're passionate about it, but there are teams that need that help because it's a never ending task to keep your technology current, to create interoperable infrastructure. The HL7 community does a lot of work with this. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. They have FHIR, FHIR. It's really hot right now. It's a great joke, but interoperability is its own use case. And if you have an understanding, there are lots of teams that they have different projects they're working on stitching that type of information together. But usually, whether it's for reporting or for some, research project, they'll usually have a focus.
Thank you.
Sounds like that there is still a lot of competitions out there.
There is. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the electronic health record space, in the US, we actually have more penetration than in other countries. They only have one electronic health record. Boy, is that nice, because I only have to write one ETL script. In the US, even Epic, there's like the 50 shades of Epic. Like, it never looks the same. We all have different tables. If you know what it looks like on the front end, good luck if you can find it on the back end. And so I think for, the takeaway for it is, like, even just appreciating and knowing that makes you a better data scientist, because you're not asking too much of your analysis. You're starting with a practical understanding of how the data became into existence and how you're kind of going to use it for what you're trying to do.
Great. So I know we're going to wrap up here soon. Before we go, I want to ask a question. It's kind of an important question for people that may want to know more about this. We've covered a lot of ground. We know being a data scientist now is a very broad field. There's a lot of different facets of it. Can you give people maybe, I don't know, let's talk maybe 2 or 3 jobs that people could get started in right out of the gates? And what would a position like that pay? Are we talking 6-figure salary right out of the gates? Give us just some things that people can chew on.
It's a good question. So I think it's tough, right? Like, the terms we use to describe jobs, I feel like we change our HR wording. So, like, how you're going to search for it, I feel like it changes every time I think of it. But let's say you really like the space. I would look for words like real world data, real world evidence. That might bias you a little bit towards things like pharmaceutical companies who are trying to do these types of analysis. Well, I will tell you, pharma has a lot of money to spend and they have a lot of regulatory requirements. So they're not the worst. It's a great place to start. You might see things like observational health or observational data. Health data science gets used a lot too, or health informatics. So the jobs could be, you might see things like, if you really like that munging piece, you might be an ETL developer or ETL analyst. You might see things like data warehouse or data architect, but like with a kind of a healthcare, life sciences kind of application. Sometimes you'll just see data scientist and you have to read the requirement to see, it's a healthcare company. I think the compensation is competitive. So I think you are looking at 6 figures in most major cities. Some places are salary adjusted, so I don't want to put a blanket, but I think it's a very competitive field in your ability to understand data systems and munge it and be able to write, if you're looking as an R programmer or Python. Sometimes AI, ML, or machine learning will come up. But I think for your immediate out of the gate, don't pick those roles unless you really have had some project work building models, just because they might, I have a really good friend who works at the Department of Treasury, and he got an MS in analytics at NC State. And I remember he was interviewing for an AI ML job, and he used to do my homework for me when I would get stuck, and I'd ask him to help audit my code, and he's phenomenal, right? And I remember him telling me about an interview he did, and they were like, how do you know the assumptions of this model stand up? And he was like, I interrogated the data. I know that it has to be parametric or non-parametric. And he was really put off by you might end up in really lines of questioning that you're like, whoa, this is a little intense. So that field depends on kind of the company, but some of them they're really specific. And I would say go for the more the analyst or position recs that kind of look like they're you're doing different parts of data science. So bringing together data, analyzing it, reporting, whatever the term would be. And I'd say somebody asked, they just said, can it be remote? So remote is becoming more and more common, especially in pandemic and post-pandemic times. I think you're going to see more people going back to the office though. And I think I actually have a lesson to share with you all here. This is like me and my like hat, but I have a really good friend who could work from anywhere, but he didn't realize his health insurance was only in one state because his employer only had California insurance because that's where their offices were. So my lesson to all of you is make sure if you work from anywhere, it actually is somewhere that has benefits that cover like where you actually want to live. Some companies so I'm leaving IQVIA, and IQVIA is a global company. We have offices everywhere. We had a lot of PSAs go out from our HR saying you can't work from different countries. There are tax laws that come up. So I think the remote piece is with an asterisk. Make sure to do your homework on taxes and your benefits. And I might sound like your dad by saying that, but as a former consultant, a management consultant that paid taxes in 4 states because you log your time where you are, it can sneak up on you. And yeah, someone says you might not have licenses to operate. Just, don't overlook that. It seems silly, but I think for data science stuff, the other thing you want to make sure is like, if you want access to certain types of data, you might not be able to live in certain places because HIPAA rules might say the cloud compute is pretty good now, but some groups are still on premise. So if you're really passionate about something, some systems, you have to be somewhere within driving distance of that type of information. I know like a lot of the NIH projects, they're all remote now, but when it's safe to go back to these campuses in White Oak in Maryland, there'll be a lot more people back there. They do a lot of in-person work. Oh yeah, so if you're interested, if you don't mind the government, the FDA and the NIH are always hiring for clinical informatics and clinical data science, or even just data science folks. And the GS scales are public, so you can actually just look up GS and you'll know exactly how much you make. The private companies, it's a little bit harder, but I'd say, do a market analysis of that region, like whatever the comp is for those types of roles, let's say in SF versus Boston, and have that in hand. Oh, clinical informatics with who? You could do it with any government agency. So I'll type out a couple of acronyms you can look up. These are kind of overlapping, but there are lots of government contracts. Like a lot of my life is like government work right now, just because we have to, right? We have to take care of our country and help find out who's getting, how is it working? Can we do anything to improve and the CDC is a big one. The CDC does a lot of data science work now. And a lot of their needs are just people that can interpret and they know these types of questions you've asked me.
Cool. And then Letty was asking 8 months experience with Woz U. How does that compare to the competition?
Well, you know what? I love the recs that say like, you start to do the math and you're like, 5 years of this, 10 years of that, 20 years of this. You're like, how old is this person? Are they like 1,000? So I think don't get stuck too much in the hard number. So piece of advice is like, I'm sure you guys have heard this, right? Like apply for the job, even if you think it's a stretch, and make a good pitch. So on paper, you should try to make it clear you have practical experience, like you're doing this coursework and you're learning different techniques of data munging, or you're looking at different data sets. Be articulate in how you present yourself. And to me, that's way more important than the number of years you've been working in a tech, because tech changes every 5 minutes. And if any of you here, I'll put my email in the chat, but if any of you want like a cold read of your CV, I actually really enjoy doing this because I think it's kind of fun to tell people like it's so easy, and it takes like 5 minutes for me to send you a note. If you're applying cold, which I don't really recommend, find a human. If you admire a company, look them up on LinkedIn, send a ping to somebody you know who knows somebody. Like I am so impressed with people who reach out to me and say, hey, we have like a 3rd degree connection, but I really want to know how to get into this. I would talk to you for hours. Like I'd help prep you because I'm like, great, you have real good like kaputska, like you've got it in your heart, like you're trying to get to that place. So don't be afraid to tell people you're interested in an area, to look up companies you admire, to watch them on social media, to follow their their press, whether it's webinars or papers or like white papers. There's tons of stuff people are disseminating. And I think the last thing I'd say is like, don't get caught up on a specific term to define yourself. Like think about your skills, because skills are really, at the end of the day, they transcend whatever verbiage we're going to use in 5 years to call this stuff. And I think all boats rise with the rising tide. So be a team player, because it will benefit your science, not just your science, but your projects, to be able to kind of bring your colleagues up, because everybody's going to be kind of learning together and you'll see different perspectives.
Yeah, that is all great advice. And I second the keeping up on the news, following what the company is doing. You know, if you're going to reach out to a company, hey, I saw that you guys just launched a new product, blah, blah, blah. Here's my experience with it. Here's what I think. Like, that is huge in any field. And all of that advice is great for any field. But all right. Well, thank you so much, Kristin. This was so informative, so interesting. Congrats on all your success. Good luck in the new position at Odyssey. We'll be following you. Anyone that wants to keep in touch with Kristin, feel free to email her, connect with her on LinkedIn. And I want to thank you guys again for having me, because I love it. I learn so much every time I moderate these. So thanks so much.
Stephanie, thank you so much for taking your time today for doing this. And Kristin, oh my God, my head is spinning. As most of you know, if you've seen me before, I'm not a technical person per se. I've learned a lot. I really love hearing about all of this, especially when you can ground it with things that are around us every day, like what we're doing with COVID, and hearing what the CDC does, what all of these acronyms, and how they use our data. And you really brought it home. So thank you so much for making it personal. It's really been great. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time of your day. And we'll see you next time for Entity, Academy, and WOZ U.
And good luck, you
Bye,
guys,
everyone.
in your career paths. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.